All right, here I am again, off the grid after, what is today, Friday? Not sure what day I'll post this, but June, up in the 90s, so have not had the energy to mow yet. Worked half a day, blah, blah, who cares? No, I had a person ask a good question. They said, oh, I see, you want to do something different, but why off the grid? Why tying that in with Christianity? And I've kind of hit on that point a few times already, but I had just recently been reminded of the famous Universe 25 experiment by Dr. John Calhoun, I believe it was. So, before I say anything else, just watch this short video on that topic, and I think it'll make a lot more sense.
In 1968, an expert on animal behavior and population control called John B. Calhoun built what was essentially a utopia for mice that was purpose-built to satisfy their every need. Despite going out of his way to ensure the inhabitants of his perfect mouse society never wanted for anything, within 2 years, virtually the entire population was dead. So, what happened? Dubbed Universe 25, Calhoun's mouse utopia was built with the needs of its mouse inhabitants firmly in mind and was designed to specifically cater to their every whim. Containing plentiful food, water, bedding, and at least initially space, the enclosure was described as populations from dozens of previous experiments, something that's kind of apparent when you realize that the enclosure was called Universe 25. Calhoun anticipated that his mouse paradise could reliably and, more importantly, comfortably house 3,840 mice. Before that, though, he needed to pick the proverbial Adam and Eve of his mouse Garden of Eden. Calhoun eventually settled on 4 breeding pairs of mice specifically bred for the experiment and handpicked from the most healthy specimens from the National Institute of Health's own breeding colony. Now, the IMH gave Calhoun access to a small piece of land that they owned in Maryland and the funding that was needed to construct Universe 25. The stated goal of the experiment was simply to see whether a perfect society would flourish. Initially, the experiment, it proved successful, and the mice lived in relative harmony, and within a year, the population of 8 super healthy mice had swelled to a respectable 620 members. Great care was taken to ensure the mice were taken care of. Food and water, it was unlimited, which allowed the mice to eat or drink whenever they pleased, and there was always space and clean bedding available, so females could rear young in peace and safety. Despite this, Calhoun noticed that after day 35 of the experiment, things started to go wrong. First of all, there was a noticeable drop in population growth. While initially the population of the mouse heaven had doubled every 55 days, after day 315 it doubled, according to Calhoun's notes, approximately every 145 days. This made little sense, as there was still ample space to house another 3,000 mice. In addition to a drop in population growth, Calhoun also noticed an abrupt change in behavior in both males and females. The social bonds broke down, and male mice, without a reason to defend their territory or food source, since both were plentiful, became dejected, forming cliques that randomly attacked one another for seemingly no reason. Females similarly began abandoning young or even attacked them, and slowly but surely both males and females simply stopped breeding. In the lead up to this, certain of the male mice began continually mating with whatever mouse happened to be around, be it male or female. Many of the mice also began to simply kill and eat one another despite the abundance of other food sources. Mothers also abandoned their babies. Mice would crowd together in groups of 50 or more in pens designed to hold 15 individuals, while pens with plentiful bedding sat completely empty, just inches away. Most intriguing of all were a small group of males and females who withdrew themselves from mouse society altogether to live in the upper levels of the enclosure that Calhoun described as the beautiful ones. These mice did nothing but sleep, eat, and groom themselves, and this gave them noticeably smoother-looking coats, which, along with their isolation, meaning no scars from attacks, led to their nickname. They seemingly lost interest in all meaningful social bonds and refused to interact or mate. The last birth in Universe 25 took place on day 600, and from that moment on, the population, it slowly dwindled. Even when the population rescinded to levels where the mice had previously flourished, they refused to breed or go back to their old way of interacting. A few months later, all of the mice were dead. Calhoun noted that although the population had survived for many months afterwards, it had effectively died on the 315th day, the day the social bonds broke down, stating, "Their spirit has died the first death. They are no longer capable of executing the more complex behaviors compatible with species survival. The species in such settings die."
All right, did any of that sound a little bit familiar to the United States and 2023? Just a few things that I thought was ironic. The mice had paradise, everything they could want. They didn't have to work for anything. That sounds kind of like today to some degree. Therefore, there was no desire, an existential crisis, a lot of sexual confusion. Not like today at all, right? And the beautiful ones, the ones that just kind of retired to their own, groomed themselves, and didn't really do anything. Again, I'm not meaning that in a harsh way. I actually feel that the previous generations are at fault for that being a good example of Generation Z today. It's not entirely their fault. But it was also a little bit scary that as many times as he ran the experiment, he could not get the mice back. Even when they went back down, their spirit was shot, and in every experiment he ran, they all died. Of course, obviously, mice and humans are different, but I don't like, it was just scary, but I think he hit the point. It wasn't so much the overpopulation piece of it, because they never even got close to the maximum population that it could do. But he said their spirit to live had died. Therefore, they quickly died what he was calling the first and second death. And again, in today's generation, everything on a silver platter. Well, part of that, maybe looking in the mirror, I'm trying to recapture a little bit of that. Partly because, I don't know, I think I've mentioned that before, but I was talking to my wife. I said, used to, we could go eat somewhere and it didn't have to be $100 a plate, especially when we were poor. And it tasted so good. And then now, to get that same reaction, we have to usually go somewhere really nice. Little Owl, New York, fantastic food. So, okay, that's part of it. Wanting to say, all right, having this perfect environment, the 5,000 square foot house. No, I need bigger. 8,000 square foot. No, bigger. I need 20 TVs. Part of that is okay, why this isn't that nice? Well, that's part of the point. Secondly, as far as the Christian element, I've mentioned that before. Francis Schaeffer, huge fan. I've even got his 10-part series, How Should We Then Live, in my playlist on my channel. Pollution and the death of man. Ahead of his time on the ecology aspect. From a Christian perspective, not be good for goodness sake, be good for God's sake. Same thing with art, again, which I had done a small book on that. Art for art's sake makes no sense if you really start to peel it back. Same way as be good for goodness sake. Well, who's good? But anyway, if you think about that from a Christian perspective, or especially a non-Christian, because honestly, a lot of the non-Christians are very adamant on Mother Nature. We gotta, save the planet. But no offense, they're usually the ones with the biggest house, every modern convenience. And I think that begs the question, why? Why don't you, even if they're secular, practice what they preach? Over here, Lord willing, it can at least serve as a humble example of at least not someone that has it figured out, more someone that's trying to figure it out a little bit better. The carbon footprint out here is almost nothing. I mean, I've got like 6 solar panels, but again, it's far from being minimalistic. Compost, uh, rainwater. I mean, it's definitely, my carbon footprint's almost nothing. Uh, so hopefully that might be another element from a Christian perspective. Also, another book by Francis Schaeffer. Great book, one of my favorites, Death in the City. And again, he kind of looks back at, here, I'll just read it from the back. But Death in the City was Schaeffer's third book, and it's foundational to his thinking, written against the backdrop of the 60s countercultural upheaval. It reads today with the same ring of truth regarding personal, moral, spiritual, and intellectual concerns, especially in light of 9/11. Schaeffer seems disturbingly prophetic. The death that Schaeffer writes about is more than just physical death. It is the moral and spiritual death that subtly suffocates truth and meaning and beauty out of the city and the wider culture. It reads very good, even though it was written some time ago. And third book, which I don't have here, it's back at the cabin. I think it was something written like L'Abri, which I've talked about before, hence the name, what I was calling mine originally, L'Abri Off-Grid, which just means French word for shelter, but it was Francis Schaeffer's concept that ended up spreading out just to answer some of the questions. Why Christianity? And said, look, let's talk. I'll answer questions the best I can. But it's kind of, his point was to say, I'm going to try to do this as an apologetic of my life, to live out the truth of Christianity. In other words, practice what I preach. And again, I have not, if I'm being true, not like saying, well, compared to, X, Y, and Z. No. I need a lot of work myself on that front. So I think when people, call out, hey, James, I think you're hypocritical here. Well, you're absolutely right. But anyway, hopefully that helps at least answer a little bit better. It's funny, there's a big old snapping turtle. Make sure, so I don't like having to ever wade out in the pond for anything. But no, hopefully that, the Universe 25 thing really kind of hit me, and I was like, dude, that's a perfect parallel, along with the Francis Schaeffer thing, just to answer the why. So anyway, food for thought, and TGIF.